There are men who accumulate wealth, and then there are men who become something else entirely, something the old families of Europe and America had no name for, because they had never seen it before. A man without ancestry, without a country, without even a legitimate passport, who forced the world to receive him on his own terms. Who sat across negotiating tables from princes and prime ministers and left with better deals than they did. Who purchased an island, acquired an airline, and commanded a fleet larger than the navy of many sovereign nations, all before the age of 50. The world watched him with a mixture of fascination and unease, the way old money has always watched new money, with the particular contempt of those who suspect, deep down, that the rules they inherited may not be as permanent as they believed. His name was Aristotle Onassis. And the story of his life is not, in the end, a story about wealth at all. It is a story about what a man will build when he has seen everything he loves burn. And what happens when the fire finds him again. To understand him, you have to understand where he stood on a September afternoon in 1922. Smyrna was one of the last genuinely cosmopolitan cities of the old Mediterranean world. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Turks, not merely coexisting but intertwined across centuries of commerce, marriage, language. The Onassis family belonged to its prosperous Greek community. His father Socrates was a tobacco merchant with modest but genuine standing. Young Aristotle, born January 20, 1906, in the Caracas suburb, had grown up speaking 4 languages before most boys his age had left school. He had advantages. He had a future that had already been partially sketched out for him, the way futures are for the sons of comfortable men in settled cities. Then Turkish forces retook the city, and the fire began. 3 of his uncles, an aunt, her husband, their daughter, burned to death inside a church in Akhisar, where 500 Christians had sought shelter. 500 people. A church. Ash. The family fortune, the property holdings, the commercial connections that had taken a generation to build, consumed in the same hours. Aristotle was 16 years old. He stood on the deck of a ship and watched the skyline of his entire life disappear into smoke. What that does to a person is not something that can be translated into polite language. It does not heal. It reorganizes. The boy who had grown up with advantages became a refugee carrying a Nansen passport, the stateless person's document, the bureaucratic proof that you belong to no nation, that no government has any particular obligation toward you. He arrived in Buenos Aires on August 21, 1923, with $250 and the specific hunger of someone who has already lost everything once and has decided, at a cellular level, that it will never happen again. He started as a hod carrier. Then a dishwasher. Eventually he secured a night shift position with the British United River Plate Telephone Company as a switchboard operator. The pay was negligible. The access was invaluable. While the businessmen of Buenos Aires assumed their late evening calls were private, a refugee boy in overalls absorbed everything. Deals being structured. Contracts approaching completion. Names. Prices. The architecture of commercial opportunity, delivered to him through a headset. During the days freed up by the night shift, he used what he had learned to position himself inside conversations he had no right to be part of. It was not, by any standard definition, an ethical practice. He would repeat the pattern, finding edges, using information asymmetry, operating just outside the rules that other people followed, for the rest of his life. It worked because he was willing to do it. And because most people were not. His instincts were not subtle. He stalked Juan Gaona, owner of Argentina's most successful cigarette company, for days, appearing wherever the man appeared, requesting meetings that were repeatedly declined, until Gaona simply agreed to listen in order to make the interruptions stop. The order that followed, $10,000 of Turkish tobacco, was not a breakthrough. It was the beginning of a pattern. Aristotle Onassis did not wait for the world to offer him a seat at the table. He pulled up a chair and sat down, and he kept sitting until people stopped trying to remove him. By 25, he was a millionaire. The Greek government, recognizing what they were looking at, appointed him consul general and asked him to negotiate a trade agreement with Argentina in 1928. He obtained Argentine citizenship the following year. The refugee boy had, in less than a decade, made himself useful to the country that had exiled his family. That transaction, turning displacement into leverage, would define his method for the rest of his life. In 1932, the year his father died, he made the observation that reoriented everything. The men who transported tobacco made more money than the men who produced it. The observation arrived at the worst possible moment for the shipping industry. The Depression had collapsed international trade, and the industry was being abandoned by everyone with enough sense to see the obvious. Ship prices had fallen to fractions of their real value. Aristotle bought 6 freight ships and said nothing. The people around him thought it was madness. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps it was the arithmetic of a man who had already been through the bottom of everything and understood that bottoms end. When the global economy recovered, demand for shipping capacity would be enormous. When that moment came, he would be positioned for it. He was not wrong. In 1938, he commissioned his first oil tanker. By the time the war began, he owned 3, registered under Panamanian flag, eliminating taxes, reducing overhead to levels no European competitor could match, making him one of the lowest-cost operators in the world. During the war, he leased his vessels to the Allies. His fleet expanded while others sank. When the war ended, he purchased 23 surplus Liberty ships from the United States at prices that look, in retrospect, almost embarrassing. And then he asked the question that built the empire. What if the ships were simply larger? Not incrementally. Fundamentally. He commissioned supertankers, vessels so large that a single 6-month lease would recover the entire cost of construction, leaving the remaining 20 years of the ship's working life as something close to pure profit. In 1954 alone, he ordered 17 of them. The economics were almost difficult to believe. But the timing was what made them decisive. When the Suez Canal closed during the Arab-Israeli conflicts of 1956 and 1967, forcing tankers to navigate around the Cape of Good Hope, the longer route destroyed the margins of every operator whose ships were built to the old scale. Aristotle's supertankers absorbed the distance without distress. The crisis that crippled his competitors was, for him, simply an acceleration. He had built for conditions that hadn't arrived yet, and then waited for the world to catch up. But wealth at this scale is never merely financial. It is social. It is political. And it is, always, a confrontation with the people who believe the world belongs to them by right of birth. Aristotle understood this. He sought those confrontations the way other men seek comfort. In Monaco, he acquired controlling interest in the Société de Bains de Mer, the holding company that owned the Monte Carlo Casino, the Hôtel de Paris, and the most valuable resort properties in the Principality. The move was not subtle and was not meant to be. He was positioning himself as the de facto economic authority of a sovereign European state. Prince Rainier III understood this immediately and responded with the full machinery of his position: political pressure, legal restructuring, the mobilization of Monaco's government against a single private citizen. What followed was years of institutional warfare conducted at the highest levels of European finance and diplomacy. Rainier eventually won. He forced Onassis to sell his shares through legislation specifically designed to remove him. It was, in the end, the one confrontation Aristotle could not buy or maneuver his way out of. The principality held. The refugee's son was expelled from the room. But the battle itself, the fact that it required a sovereign government to remove him, that a stateless boy from a burning city had to be legislated out of a European principality rather than simply declined, said everything about what he had become. And about what the old establishment still feared he might become. His ongoing rivalry with Stavros Niarchos ran deeper, and longer, and uglier. Niarchos was everything the old Greek shipping world recognized as legitimate: established family, established money, the right surnames and the right connections cultivated over generations. Where Onassis had clawed his way in through audacity and information and the willingness to operate at the edges of the rules, Niarchos belonged to the structure by birth. They bid against each other for the same contracts, the same vessels, the same routes. They undercut each other with a consistency that went well beyond commercial logic into something that looked, from the outside, like obsession. Each man seemed to require the other's diminishment in order to feel fully arrived. When Tina Livanos, Aristotle's ex-wife, the mother of his children, eventually married Niarchos after her own second divorce, the rivalry crossed into territory that commerce had no language for. It was no longer about ships or contracts or market share. It was about something that had no name and no resolution. And it never found one. Olympic Airways, acquired in 1957, became his most public possession, a national carrier that wasn't national at all but privately controlled, operated to a standard of service that no commercial airline could match. Gold-plated utensils in first class. Candles at dinner. Comet 4B jets in 1959 when the competition was still catching up. It was, in the way everything he built was, simultaneously a commercial enterprise and a demonstration. A statement about what a man without origins could produce when the old gatekeepers were not paying sufficient attention. He bought the Greek island of Scorpios for 3.5 million drachmas, and the yacht Christina, named for his daughter, 125 meters of floating palace, became his actual home, the place where the world's elite arrived at his invitation and discovered that the hospitality of a refugee's son was more lavish than anything their own fortunes had produced. Winston Churchill spent time on that yacht. So did presidents. Heads of state. Artists. The century's most recognizable names, gathered on a vessel that belonged to a man who had arrived in Argentina with a Nansen passport and $250. But none of it, not the fleet, not the island, not the airline, not the casino battle, not the yacht, was what would define him. What would define him was a woman. In the summer of 1957, at a party in Venice, Aristotle Onassis met Maria Callas for the first time. He observed to a friend that there was a natural curiosity between them. After all, he said, they were the most famous Greeks alive. It was a true observation, characteristically delivered as if it were merely an interesting coincidence rather than the precise reason he had engineered the introduction. Maria Callas had been born in New York in December of 1923 to Greek immigrants who brought her to Athens during the war. What she had built from those circumstances was not simply a career. It was a transformation of the art form itself, an emotional and theatrical intelligence applied to the operatic repertoire with a precision that critics struggled to describe because they had encountered nothing quite like it before. Audiences did not simply admire her. They were undone by her. The specific quality of her performances, the darkness inside the beauty, the grief that seemed to come from somewhere genuinely personal, was not something that could be manufactured by technique alone. She was, at the time of their meeting, married to Giovanni Battista Meneghini, an Italian industrialist 30 years her senior who managed her career and much of her life. The marriage had given her Italian citizenship and the administrative stability she needed to establish herself in Italy. In exchange, It had cost her a degree of autonomy that someone of her particular force of personality could only have accepted during the years when she needed it most. 2 years passed before the attraction between Aristotle and Maria became impossible to contain. In 1959, he invited her in Meneghini on a 3-week Mediterranean cruise aboard the Christina. Other guests included Winston Churchill. Callas reportedly told friends afterward that she had found Churchill tedious, which, if true, was exactly the kind of observation she would make, and one that required a very particular kind of confidence to voice. She initially found Onassis over-attentive and not particularly compelling. He pursued her with the methodical patience he had applied to everything from cigarette buyers to tanker contracts. The romantic setting was not incidental. He had chosen it. The Christina was his instrument of persuasion, a floating environment he controlled entirely, where the ordinary structures of life did not apply and where resistance, eventually, became exhausting. By the time the cruise ended, it was visible to everyone aboard. Tina Lavanos, who had arrived at the start of the voyage as a social presence, disembarked early rather than continue watching what had become undeniable. Both marriages were effectively finished. What followed was 9 years of a relationship that could not be called functional by any standard definition, and yet was clearly the defining emotional fact of both their lives. The power between them was never equally distributed. But Maria Callas was not a passive figure in this arrangement, and it would be a mistake to read her that way. She was a woman of formidable will who had fought her way to the pinnacle of a brutally competitive art form, who had managed domineering figures her entire life, and who made her own choices, including the choice to remain. She was not held there by circumstance. She stayed because she wanted to. Their connection was real and complicated in ways that neither of them seems to have fully understood at the time. She played a role in his life that no one else had occupied, something between romantic partnership and the kind of steady, unglamorous presence he had rarely known. He had never been that kind of loved. She knew it. And she used that knowledge, even as it cost her. She became pregnant in 1960 and lost the baby while he was elsewhere. She conceived again in 1963 and lost that pregnancy too, while he was hosting Jacqueline Kennedy aboard the Christina. The timing had the quality of something deliberate, even though it was not. The career did not collapse all at once. It receded. Performance by performance, year by year, as her attention shifted and her voice deteriorated without the practice that a voice at that level requires. When Franco Zeffirelli asked her in 1963 why she hadn't been practicing, she said she had been trying to fulfill her life as a woman. It was an honest answer. It was also a choice made by someone who had spent 20 years being defined entirely by what she could produce, and who perhaps, for the first time, wanted to be known for something else. That the choice ultimately cost her everything does not mean it wasn't hers to make. He was also watching another woman. And in 1963, aboard the Christina, Jacqueline Kennedy and her sister Lee Radziwill were among the guests. Lee was rumored to be in some kind of personal arrangement with Aristotle. By the end of that voyage, whatever arrangement had existed was clearly over. He gave Jackie a diamond necklace at the voyage's conclusion. He gave Lee a bracelet so minor that she would later observe, with the precision of someone who understood the language of expensive gifts perfectly, that not even a 6-year-old child would have worn it. The message required no translation. 5 more years passed. Maria waited, and hoped, and understood somewhere inside herself what she was not yet prepared to acknowledge publicly. And then, in October of 1968, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy on the island of Scorpios. The announcement stunned the world in ways that are difficult to reconstruct at this distance. She was the widow of the 35th President of the United States. She was the woman who had stood at the coffin, who had worn the blood-stained suit, who had been the composed face of American grief for 5 years. She occupied a place in public imagination that was something close to sacred, not because of what she had done but because of what she had endured, and how she had endured it, without ever visibly breaking. And she was marrying him. It is easy, and perhaps too easy, to reduce Jacqueline Kennedy's decision to calculation. But she was a woman who had watched 2 men she was close to be assassinated within 5 years, who had lived inside a level of public surveillance that left no room for private grief, and who had 2 children she was trying to raise inside the permanent catastrophe of the Kennedy legacy. Aristotle offered something real: security, distance from America, the protective cover of his particular kind of power. Whether she loved him, whether she was capable of loving anyone in the way the world demanded of her, that is a question she kept to herself, with a discipline that never broke in public. The financial terms were negotiated with the Kennedy family before the ceremony. $3 million up front. $1 million for each of her children, Caroline and John Jr. $150,000 annually upon Aristotle's death, for the remainder of her life. The transaction was not hidden. It was simply absorbed into the spectacle, the way all transactions are when the sums are large enough. Maria received the news in Paris. 9 years. 2 lost pregnancies. A career given up. The specific, private humiliation of being replaced not by a younger woman, not by someone whose accomplishments could be quietly minimized, but by the most famous widow in the world. Whatever his reasons were, and they were almost certainly more tangled than any single explanation can hold, the result was the same. Maria Callas, who had given him everything she had, was set aside. And the woman who replaced her was Jacqueline Kennedy. The marriage was not a failure in the ordinary sense. It was something more awkward than that, a union that delivered exactly what both parties had negotiated for, and nothing they hadn't. Jackie maintained 6 residences between them and occupied none of them together with Aristotle for any sustained period. She remained in New York, in her 15-room apartment on Fifth Avenue, in the social world that had always been hers. He was everywhere his empire demanded. The distance was not a symptom of something going wrong. It was, from the beginning, the shape of the thing itself. But Maria had not disappeared. Even during the marriage, Aristotle met with her in Paris. He told her, according to those who were close to both of them, that she was the true love of his life. That he had understood it too late to do anything with the understanding. What passed between them in those years, in those rooms in Paris, belongs entirely to them. None of it was recorded in any form that survives. And then the gods or fate, or the particular cruelty of random mechanical failure, which amounts to the same thing, sent January 22, 1973. Alexander Onassis arrived at Hellenikin International Airport in Athens for a routine test flight. He was 24 years old. As president of Olympic Aviation, his father's airline subsidiary, he was overseeing a pilot evaluation. He held 1,500 flying hours. He had earned his commercial certificate with genuine commitment, not the token accumulation of a rich man's son looking for a hobby. Flying was the one place where his father's empire ended. Up there, in the cockpit, the name Onassis was simply a name. No shadow reached that altitude. His relationship with Aristotle had never been uncomplicated. The divorce in 1960 had fractured something in both children that wealth could not repair. The marriage to Jackie in 1968 had widened the fracture. Alexander had characterized the arrangement with the bluntness of a young man who had stopped managing his father's feelings. Aristotle loved the name, Jackie loved the money. And he had been moving, in the year before his death, toward a declaration of separation from Olympic, from his father's manipulations, from the life that had been organized around the Onassis name rather than his own. He intended to marry Fiona Campbell Tyson, a woman 16 years his senior, beautiful and independent, of whom Aristotle disapproved with the thoroughness of a man who had never accepted limits on his own choices. That conversation about Fiona, about the future, about what Alexander intended his life to be, was still unresolved. His Piaggio P.136 lifted from runway 33 on a clear afternoon. Donald McCusker, the pilot recruit, was aboard. Donald McGregor, his regular pilot, recovering from an eye infection. The right wing dropped. It stayed down. The aircraft lost control. 15 seconds. All three men were critically injured. Alexander was transferred first to the American Military Base Hospital, then to KAT Hospital in Athens. Aristotle was in New York when the call came. Those present said he collapsed before he could speak. He flew in the next morning. He brought the English neurosurgeon Alan Richardson from London. Richardson told him directly, catastrophic cranial and cerebral injury. No possibility of survival. On January 23, 1973, at 7 in the evening, 27 hours after the crash, Alexander Onassis died. The two American pilots who had been aboard the same aircraft recovered. Relatively minor injuries. The same aircraft. The same 15 seconds. Aristotle could not accept it. Would not accept it. The official finding, reversed aileron connecting cables, incorrectly installed during routine maintenance, was, to him, not an explanation but an insult. His son had 1,500 hours of flying experience. He died in 15 seconds while both other men survived. The mathematics of it were impossible. It had to be deliberate. It had to be someone. He blamed the CIA. He blamed the Greek military junta. He blamed Stavros Niarchos, who had married his ex-wife and whose rivalry with Aristotle had, over the years, taken on the quality of something that could not be resolved by any available means. He blamed employees, mechanics, unnamed forces. In December of 1974, he took out a paid advertisement in major newspapers offering $1 million for proof that Alexander's death had been deliberate rather than accidental. The reward was never claimed. The charges were dropped. The cables remained what they had always been, a maintenance error. Fatally careless. Meaningless. Alexander was buried on Scorpios. The island where the Christina had moored during the early golden years with Maria. The island where he had married Jackie. The island that had been, in its various seasons, the most private and beautiful place he owned, now the ground where his only son lay in the earth at 24 years old. After that, the man people had known was not quite present anymore. The friends and associates who had spent decades watching Aristotle fill every room he entered, watching him turn every conversation into a negotiation and every negotiation into a victory, they described what followed as a disappearance that happened while he was still physically present. He had survived the burning of Smyrna. Poverty. War. The dissolution of 2 marriages. Business rivals who had tried to destroy him. He had rebuilt himself from nothing so many times that people had stopped counting. But he had rebuilt always with Alexander as the horizon. The empire was not an end in itself. It was the inheritance. It was the thing he was building so that his son would receive it, carry the name forward, justify all of it. Without Alexander, the empire was simply accumulated. Things. Owned. Silent. His health had been compromised for years, respiratory problems managed below the threshold of crisis. Now they advanced. His marriage to Jackie became what it had always threatened to become, an arrangement maintained by nothing except the inconvenience of ending it. He had come to believe, in the particular logic of grief, that she had brought a curse. John Kennedy. Robert Kennedy. Now Alexander. The pattern felt undeniable to a man whose superstitions had always run beneath his pragmatism like a second system of reasoning. Christina shared the belief and expressed it openly. She had disliked Jackie from the beginning. The household became a place of sealed doors and conversations that stopped when certain people entered. Maria was in Paris. She was always in Paris now. Her voice, which had once required only the application of her will, had deteriorated past the point where will was sufficient. She gave fewer and fewer performances, than none. She lived quietly, in the apartment that had contracted around her gradually over the years since she had stopped performing, the way spaces contract around people who stop requiring them to be large. Aristotle came when he could. He told her what he had realized. She did not respond with anger. She may not have responded much at all. The recognition had arrived past the point where it could do anything except confirm what she had always known and what had cost her everything to act as though she didn't. He checked into the American hospital in Paris in early 1975. Among the things he brought with him was a red cashmere Hermes blanket that Maria had given him. Not a ship. Not a painting. Not any of the things that filled the ledgers and inventories of a life built to be impressive. A blanket. The kind of object that has no monetary value and resists all the systems through which he had organized his entire existence. He clung to it. On March 15, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died of respiratory failure at a clinic in Neuilly-sur-Seine, near Paris. He was 69 years old. He was buried on Scorpios, beside Alexander. After his death, Christina settled with Jackie for $25 million in exchange for Jackie's agreement not to contest the will. The contracted payments continued for the remainder of Jackie's life. Christina inherited 55% of her father's fortune. The remaining 45% was directed to the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, established in memory of the son who had died before the inheritance was ready for him. Christina did not carry the empire long. 4 marriages, each ending in divorce. Depression that wealth could not address. An inability to locate, inside all that she had inherited, anything resembling peace. She died in Buenos Aires in 1988, of a heart attack, at 37 years old. The city where her father had first arrived, nearly penniless, with a stateless passport and $250. Maria Callas died on September 16, 1977, alone in her Paris apartment. She was 53. In 1979, her ashes were scattered off the coast of Scorpios. She rests, finally, near the man who was simultaneously the center of her life and the person most responsible for its hollowing out. The empire dissolved across decades in the way that all empires built by one person dissolve once that person is gone. The Christina became a floating museum. Olympic Airways returned to the Greek government. Scorpios was eventually sold. The 217 bank accounts, the tanker contracts, the airline routes, the island paradise, the Monaco battle, the gathering of presidents and artists on a yacht in the Aegean, all of it scattered, absorbed, reduced to footnote. What the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation continues to do is something quieter and more durable: scholarships for Greek students, support for medicine and education, prizes for achievement in various fields. An institution designed not to generate profit but to provide opportunity. To give young Greeks what a boy from Smyrna once had to manufacture for himself, from nothing, under circumstances that would have broken most people before the attempt began. It is a fitting legacy. And it is not what he would have chosen. He would have chosen one more year with his son. One more ordinary afternoon on the deck of a ship that was not on fire. The story of Aristotle Onassis is not, in the final accounting, a story about excess. It is not a warning about hubris, though the Greeks who knew him thought they were watching exactly that. It is a story about a particular kind of displacement, the kind that follows a person long after the physical displacement has ended. He left Smyrna behind. He never escaped the lesson Smyrna taught him. That everything burns. That nothing holds. That the only safety is accumulation, and more accumulation, and then more still. Whether a different man, a man less marked by that burning city, less formed by the specific education of catastrophe and exile, could have built the same empire and also kept the people he loved close, we cannot know. Perhaps the hunger that built the fleet was inseparable from the blindness that destroyed the family. Perhaps not. What we can say is that Aristotle Onassis, the specific man that history produced, never found a way to hold both things at once. The empire consumed the attention that the living required. And by the time he understood this, the living had already run out of time to wait for him. He discovered it at the end. In a hospital room near Paris, with nothing left to hold except a blanket from the woman he had loved longest and treated worst. A man arrives in a foreign city with $250 and a document that says he belongs nowhere. He builds something the world has never seen. He loses the only thing that justified the building. And he dies in a borrowed bed, holding something that cost almost nothing, given to him by someone he never quite deserved. That is the whole story. And it refuses, even now, to resolve into anything simple. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to join the Golden Years family. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Let's meet again behind the scenes of history. Goodbye.